Hello, I'm Jane Mills. I would like you to know a little bit about my life. My story started on June 25, 1841. I was born in Bedford-Lee, Lancashire, England. My father Thomas Mills was born in 1816 in England. My mother Ann W. Clegg was born in 1819 in England. They had 15 children. My mother died in England, but my father came to America. I married George Hone on April 24, 1864, at age 22 in Lancaster. He was born in 1840 in Atterbury. He was 24 years old when we married, 2 years older than me. We had 13 children: George, Eliza, Mary, Thomas, George, Emma, William, Robert, Louis, Lily, Rosella, Walter, and Lawrence. Families were large back then. All our children were born in Utah. George and I had 28 lovely grandchildren. From our daughter Eliza we had James. From our son Thomas, we had Leroy, Arnold, Reva, Alvin, Glendor, Elmer, Dot, Pamela, Mary, and David. From our son William, we had Ida, Lexi, Rulon, Vera, Muriel, and Jenny. From our daughter Louie, we had Desta, John, and Doris. From our daughter Lily, we had Vivian, George, Meryl, and Beta. We had Laverne and Rosella from our daughter Rosella. We had Velda from our son Lawrence. At 8 years of age, I started to work in the factory of William Charles Jones. For the first 5 years of my work in the factory, I worked in the cop cellars. I worked half the day and went to school the other half. For this work I received the wage of 25 cents a week, and from this amount I paid 12 cents every week for school tuition. When I was 13 years of age, I was considered of full age and had to work 10.5 hours a day in the factory, and for this work received a little over $1 a week. The factory had 3 stories. In the basement there were 4 rooms: the cop cellar, scuttle room or the devil's weaving rooms, and at one end part of the engine room. On the second floor was the spinning room. On the third floor was the dressing room, card room, twisting room, and off to one side was the ringing or warping room, mechanical shop and warehouse. I worked in the basement in the cop cellar until I was 17. For 9 years, which was the full length of time I worked in the cop cellar, I worked under Richard Waterworth. The factory in which I worked was the only one that did all kinds of work. Other factories did different kinds. For example, one would do spinning, another weaving, and so on. Work in the cop cellars was hard on the health. You had your hands in water and stood in water all day. I would get up about 5 o'clock in the morning, get dressed, grab a piece and run to the factory. I had to be inside of the factory gates by 6 or else I would be locked out. At 8:30 we would stop work for breakfast. We had from 8:30 until 9 o'clock to eat breakfast, and from 1 until 2 o'clock was our dinner hour. When I was 17, I quit the cop cellar and went to weaving cotton. I had to have wet filling and could not stand the work, so after 8 months I left cotton weaving and went to weave silk. I worked at silk weaving until I was 23 years of age. When a weaver leaves the factory, he or she weaves a black piece of cloth, which is called their farewell warp. They receive an extra high price of 37 shillings 16 for the farewell warp. I set sail for America on the General McClellan on the 26th day of May, 1864. We arrived in New York July 3, 1864, but were not permitted to land for 2 days. We then traveled 2 days and nights on the railroad. We crossed the plains in Captain Warren Snow's company. There were 800 in the company. We arrived in Salt Lake City October 3, 1864. The Indians were troublesome, but we were not bothered with them very much. Once a man came to the captain and wanted some flour to give to the Indians so they wouldn't bother us, but the captain said he thought they could get along without it. There was a supply camp along the road, but by the time we reached it had been destroyed by the Indians. One day I went off in the hills alone. A guard saw me go and kept watch for me. There was an Indian coming over the hill after me, but he saw the guard and turned back. At one time they sent an army of soldiers to protect us. I was surely frightened, but we were not molested. Sometimes we walked in ahead of the wagons, but when the soldiers came, they told us to stay by the wagons, thinking we would be safer. There was for tea every so far along the road. The Indians had killed 11 teamsters in a company just ahead of us. We had to wade the Mississippi River. When crossing the ocean, we held meetings every Sunday morning on the ship, and we held meetings every night while crossing the plains. We had family prayer every day. There were 3 families in one tent, and we made one long bed and all slept in it. We camped in Echo Canyon the night of October 2nd, and came into Salt Lake City the morning of October 3rd. It was conference time. There we met Brigham Young and shook hands with him. We then left for Provo before breakfast with a man by the name of Russell Chanley. We reached Provo that day before dark. Aunt Sarah Hone had supper ready for us. We lived in Provo until January 1870 when we moved to Benjamin. We were the parents of 13 children, 6 of whom are still living. My husband made adobes for our home, and built one room just the walls. There were no floor nor roof. That was the way the house stood when we moved in. We arrived in Benjamin January 8, 1870, at 10 o'clock at night. We had one wagon, an ox team, and in the wagon, we had roofing, flooring, household furniture, all of our belongings, and our 2 children. We put some boards down for a floor so we could make our beds and put some roofing across the walls to cover us. There were still no doors nor windows. There was a fireplace built in one end of the room. We built shelves on either side of the fireplace to serve as a cupboard. Doors and windows were added one at a time. We bought them by catching muskrats and selling the hides. My first table was made out of quaking aspen poles for legs with boards nailed on for the top. My bed was made of quaking aspen also. My rocking chairs were made of quaking aspen poles hewed out for rockers and a calf hide for the bottom. My husband broke up the land by spring and planted a garden. He grubbed the greasewoods out and spaded it up. He then planted some small fruit trees, apples, plums, and pears. Later he purchased more farming land. We lived in Benjamin for the next 36 years. My husband farmed and kept bees. We prospered very well, and later we tore the old adobe house down and built a large frame house that still stands. 10 of our 13 children were born while we lived in Benjamin. About the year 1906 we moved to Payson, where we lived about 10 years. While we were living in Payson, we celebrated our 50th wedding anniversary. By this time, we were getting old, and our health was not good, so we moved back to Benjamin, close to our daughter, Louise Shepherd, so she could help take care of us. We lived in Benjamin the next 7 years. My husband's health was failing fast, so my daughter, Eliza Ann McClellan, came and took us to her home in Payson. 3 days later my husband died. He was then 85 years old. He died November 10, 1925. I am now 91 years old and still live with my daughter in Payson. I died the 11th of March 1934 in Payson.